Today we're going to go through routing your data cables on the Minn Kota Ultrex. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Ethernet cable and your built-in sonar cable to route them appropriately so that you don't cut those cables and so that you don't create any sonar interference. So we're going to need a couple of things to get started. First, we've got a few zip ties here so that we can fasten those cables when we get them into the position. We're also going to need a means of cutting those zip ties when they're installed. Any means to cut those off cleanly is fine. For the purposes of what we're doing, we're going to use just a side cutter. We also have some black electrical tape here. We're not going to use this, but a lot of guys choose to use this versus the zip ties. But we don't really like to use this because it gets kind of gooey over time as you use it as it gets exposed to the heat and humidity of the summer. So we're going to use zip ties. One important thing to remember when you're using zip ties is that you do not over tighten these. If you leave a dent in the jacket of the cable, they're too tight and you run the risk of damaging the shield inside the sonar cable. So if you use the zip ties, be sure not to over tighten them. So the first thing we're going to do here is establish an anchor point for the Ethernet and sonar cables by zip tying them to the base of the coil cord where it exits the head of the trolling motor. Loop it around those sonar and Ethernet cables. And again, not over tightening these, but just creating a nice anchor point up against that base of the coil cord. And then we'll cut the tail off. Now we've established a good anchor point. So the reason we anchor those data cables up there is so that as the motor spins, it takes the stress off of those cables where they come out of the head of the motor. So now we're going to create a working loop with the sonar and Ethernet cables. To do that, I'm going to hold the cables loosely at the base of the coil cord where it goes down into this jacket. I'm going to hold them loosely there and now rotate the head of the motor till I come to the stop. Rotate it the other direction and let those cables slide through my hand so that we can get the proper length we need so that as the motor rotates, we've got enough length of cable there for those sonar and Ethernet cables to move freely. So now that I've got that length established, I'll take another one of my zip ties and create that other anchor point right there at the other base of the coil cord. Not a bad idea to give yourself just a little bit extra when you do that as well. And again, don't crank that zip tie down too tight, just enough to hold it in position. Now that you've got that second anchor point established, you can go ahead and cut the tail off of the zip tie. Now we're going to loop those cables around the outboard side of this boot here so that we can get it over to the arm of the Ultrex. And we're going to put our first anchor point right there. So I'll take my zip tie and loop that around the arm. And I'm going to leave these zip ties a little loose at first. We're going to check to make sure that as we stow and deploy, there's enough movement there. We're going to put another one on the next part of the arm. Again, leaving those a little loose. And then one more on this third upright of the arm. If you've got a longer mount, a 52 or a 60-inch Ultrex, you may have 4 of these. But this is a 45-inch, so we've only got 3. Okay. Now that we've got our anchor points established on the arm of the Ultrex, now we're going to do a quick stow and deploy to make sure that the cables remain clear of the critical pinch points before we route them into the boat. So now that we've done the stow and deploy sequence a couple of times to make sure we've got enough freedom of movement in those data cables, that's why we left these loose. You can see how big of a loop we've got here by the boot. So now we're going to clean that up. We'll put a couple of zip ties on here, and then we're going to tighten these down as well so we can finish the installation inside the boat. So I'm just going to throw a couple more zip ties on here to keep these together and clean. Go ahead and cut those tails off. So now we got to finish up by tightening these down as well so that those hold their position. Now that we've got the data cable secured through the coil cord and along the arm, we're ready to bring it into the boat. So we're just going to bring it along the fiberglass in this particular instance so that we can secure it to the deck of the boat right before we go to our connection points at our fish finders and our Ethernet hub. So how you do it from there for your particular setup is up to each individual. But the point here is to make sure you secure it in such a way that when the motor gets stowed and deployed, you've got enough range of motion for the cables to move, but also that the cables don't get pinched by the motor as it stows and deploys.